that's okay. That's not good. So, in chapter 14 of verse 1, at the time Herod the Tetrarch, hearing of the fame of Jesus, said to his servants, "This is John the Immerser, who is raised from the dead, and therefore miracles are performed by him," and so on. Now, if you go over to Luke and Mark, so all you got to do is go back over to Mark chapter 6. And it says here in chapter 6 of Mark in verse 14, and Herod the king heard of for Jesus had become well known, and he said, John the Immerser has risen from the dead, and therefore miracles performed by him. So he's reflecting back, going, oh my gosh, I killed this guy. What's he doing coming back, right? So then you go over to Luke, so it's all reflections, but in Luke is where he really lays down, he talks about how Jesus was helping the crowd. What's that?
He said, wait, what did Herod say about being raised from the dead in Matthew 14?
He's talking about thinking that Jesus is John the Baptist reincarnated or raised from the dead. He's thinking Jesus is John the Baptist back alive again. That's what he's thinking.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's what he's thinking. He's thinking that. And right now, I'm trying to find, okay. So in Luke 7, it occurred, I see, look at this now. So you see in Luke 7, and verse 9, Jesus tells you about, I tell you, I have not even found in Israel such great faith. On verse 11 of Luke 7, and it occurred the next day, he was going to the city of Nain, which is up here. You saw it right here, right? He's up here, right? And disciples were going with him, and there was a great crowd. This was definitely, this is after the Passover, obviously the first one. It's also, I would say, in reference to what I'm talking about, John the Baptist is in prison still. And he's wanting to know. So if you go and see in verse 17, and this report concerning him pervaded all Judea and all the surrounding country. And John's disciples told him of all these things. And summoning two of his disciples, John sent to the Lord, saying, are you the coming one, or are we to expect another? And having come to him, men said, John the Immerser sent to us, saying, are there come one, or do we expect another? And in that hour he delivered many from diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and he gave many sight to the blind. And Jesus answered, said to them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind are made to see, the lame are to walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, glad tidings are announced to the poor, and happy is he who should not stumble at me. And John's messengers, having departed, he began to say to the crowds concerning John, why went you out into the desert to see a reed shaken by the wind? And he goes on. So the point being that this is being said, John was still alive when Jesus began to do tons of healings when all the apostles were present, which is after the first Passover, after the second Passover, because he had to gather them in between the first year he was gathering disciples. If you remember, I had that 12 disciples lesson we did. He was gathering disciples throughout the year, April, June, July, and so forth. And then he has the next Passover, and he starts to travel. He's traveling throughout, but he travels tremendously, and crowds start to follow him. In John chapter 6, or chapter 5, excuse me, in John 5, after that Passover in John 5 verse 1, notice how it says, after that Passover, number 2, there was lying a multitude of the sick, blind, lame, withered, and so forth, and he went down to bathe. There's another healing going on. The person lay down on the couch, remember that one? You just take up your mat and walk. That's happening. So you turn your page in your diaglot, and John chapter 5, and you keep reading, and you move over and to then go into, he talks about chapter 6, and after these things Jesus went across that lake of Galilee to Tiberias. So he's traversing, and it says, in a great crowd, verse 2, following him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. That sounds a lot like what he told his people to tell John the Baptist, hey, tell him what you saw, which clearly happened after the second Passover. which means John was alive for over a year in prison. Because he was in prison during the first Passover, and he was alive after the second Passover, because Jesus performed these signs and miracles, and he tells the people to tell John, tell him what you saw, which you know happened before the third Passover, which is recorded in John chapter 6, verse 4. Hope you see that. So again, he travels a lot, crowds follow, and so he tells John the Baptist that he is the one. Right? Do you see that? And that's from Luke. Go back to that again. So that's Luke 7. Luke chapter 7. And that was verses I'm going to say verses 8 to 23. No, 8 to 24 actually. I'm going to say that. 8 to 24. So Luke 7, 8 to 24. So then Herod's birthday comes around. But there's no record, by the way, when he was born. I looked it up, and no one knows. No one knows his month of when he was born. All they know is the year. They don't know the month. That doesn't help me any. They know the month to know what birthday the celebration was when he was beheaded. So I don't know for certain when John was beheaded. I don't know what month that is. I just know this. He was in prison before Passover, which means because Jesus said he was recognized him not being there, which they didn't share Passover together. So that means, check this out now, that means that ever since the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, once John the Baptist put the mantle on him as the lots fell on him to fulfill Purim, and he left for the wilderness, he never saw him again. Wow. They never shared again the time together. That's pretty sad. And that's why Jesus, knowing who John the Baptist was and our figure of a great man of faith, he said, no one born of woman ever or since or after would be greater than him. Talk about a person, this speaks volumes to me. And there's this whole song about the Gaither saying there are many that think they're just casting bread on the water and nothing's going to come of it. John the Baptist, of all people, could be a person who could stand before us right now and say, I testify to you that my life, according to God himself, was admonished as the greatest that ever was lived, but I'm the one who saw the least of him.
But when they were children,
it's crazy.
They were cousins, and Elizabeth must have told them much. They must have had some kind of...
Yeah, when they were interacting as kids, Todd and I talked about this actually, when they were acting as kids, they had a lot of interaction together. But as far as when he became into his fullness of his ministry, when he began to actually teach and equip and have the authority of God to fulfill this ministry, that may be the offset of that when he was a younger child, he had that time, to your point, as a cousins, all those, I'm sure they probably were talking about things. I imagine that's happening. But God doesn't tell us all that, But I'm sure there were some conversations they had as really tight friends, but then they lost each other's way as far as in their communication to each other was just gone, because you can tell there's no record of them talking up to this point where he sees them. So whether they were or not, there's no record of that. But the thing is that when he just began his ministry, when he began to really, show everybody, start fulfilling the prophecies of being the Messiah, John had the least interaction with that, which you would think would be the opposite. He'd have the most interaction given what he had. You'd think he'd be like, Jesus. It's just amazing. So it's almost as if the lesson there from John is that when God's got the blessings in store to be bestowed upon you, don't do what you do for what you're going to get. Do it because you just want to do it and because you know it's what God wants from you. Because John never got to reap the benefits of his labor, the fruits of his labor. He didn't get to reap that. I'm sure he would have loved to have seen Christ at Passover. How could you not want to? You lived your whole life to say, to announce, he's the guy. Then he goes away, you get in prison, you're like, are you kidding me? He's coming back to town for the first time ever. Passover's being fulfilled before our very eyes, and I can't be there to see it. It's got to kill him inside. Like, are you kidding me? And then another year goes by, same thing again. And that's why he goes, is this the guy or not? They want to know, is this the guy? And they go, no, he's the guy. So Jesus tells them, I'm the guy. I've healed people. I've made limbs grow back. I've raised the dead. He's like, yeah, he's the guy. And then that makes John die in peace when he's later on beheaded. He knows it doesn't matter, you know. But it's very interesting how he was imprisoned for not just a year, but 2 years. What I was getting to before is later on when Jesus is tried, when he's hurled throughout the night by the Jewish guard and the Roman guard from midnight through 9 a.m., he's hurled throughout this ridiculous, heinous hatefulness from 12 to 9 o'clock till he's on a cross being crucified. So from midnight till about 3 p.m., he goes through hell, literally. I mean, it's insanity. It's a lot of time in there. So he's got 12 from midnight till 9, he's being judged and punched and smacked and imprisoned. And then he comes out to get crucified from 9 to 3. So you look at the time frame of that, it's a lot of time. Is it 15 hours? Is that right? Yeah. 15 hours of being treated like hateful, disdained, they just hate him. And so at that same time, where were the apostles at? They were scared. All but John was there at the cross. But not even John or anyone was there when he was being tried. They weren't there. They weren't there in the room with the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas, Annas, Sanhedrin. They weren't there with Pilate and Herod. They weren't there. They weren't there. There was no record of them being there. They were at best in the vicinity outside the area where that was happening. But they weren't actually in the room. They were apart from that. Just like Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Passover, but John was imprisoned in Herod's prison, which is, by the way, in Galilee, up here. He's imprisoned up here. So John is dying inside. He can't observe feast days, but nor can he even be in. So Jesus is passing by constantly, traveling, and he's not able to see him. Oh, it's going to just destroy him inside. But it just really speaks volumes how we're not supposed to do what we do because of what's out ahead for us or because of what God can give to us. It's because we're supposed to just be fulfilled and happy that we were just able to do what we were supposed to do. We were commanded to do. Well, that was our job to do, and just be thankful. But we're also not out of the ordinary when we question and say, is this really worth it? Because if John the Baptist can say that, then it's okay that you and I have had that moment in our life where don't lie. Come on, we've all been there, where you love on somebody and you're doing things for the Lord and you don't see any things in return, or you don't see any movement of goodness, and you're like, gosh, it's not worth it. And then finally God just reminds you, but it is worth it, daughter, son, it is worth it. It is true what you're doing. It's right what you're doing. Keep it up. Keep doing what you're doing. And so even John needed to be encouraged. Even John reminds us it doesn't matter what we see as our fruit of our labor. What matters is embrace the process, endure the process, be joyful through the process, and know that you're fulfilling the will of God in your life. And that's what matters. And so the disciples had the same thing happen to them. They were actually, Jesus is being tempted, and he's in prison. Now they're being not in prison, being tempted in fear of life. And they're also, again, separated. And again, they're questioning the fruit of their labor. What's it all for? We followed him and now he's gone. You know, remember the road to Emmaus? When they were all sad and depressed? They were sharing in that grief. So it's interesting symmetry between the beginning and end of his ministry. The closest people to him, the 1 and the 12, they all both questioned, or I should say the 11, because Judas killed himself. They had questioned their relevance to their purpose in following. So anyway, so John the Baptist was killed between the second and third Passover of Jesus, which means he was in prison for over a year. So he was in prison for over a year. So John the Baptist died. I believe personally he died potentially on some. It could have been that he died sometime after the second Passover, but before the third one. I always conjecture as to the month in which he died. Could he have died in the month in where, the temple itself was destroyed, or when it was rebuilt? I don't know. We don't know. That's all. I don't know. I just know he died after the second Passover. Oh, I should say after Passover number 2. After Passover number 2. Sometime prior to Passover number 3. How do I know that? Because Passover number 3 happens in the timeline after he had already been dead. So you know that. So he was, because Herod heard about the crowds, and he had already killed him, and so he had the crowds he heard about was after number 2, so he was dead before the third one. So he was imprisoned for, that means 1-2 Passovers. So he was in prison actually for for 1 year. So from Passover 1 to 2, that's 1 year plus. So he was imprisoned, died at Passover 1. So that means he was imprisoned for over a year. Yes. And I think also he speaks to the fact that, remember, Jesus brought captivity captive and gave gifts to men. John was definitely righteous, but he was captive for an entire year. I think it was just over a year, showing unity that he had with those who were already captive in heaven as well, because they couldn't partake freely and just be around. They're in paradise in heaven. Yes.
Vicky said, why did they behead John the Baptist? Just the whim of his daughter, or was there more to it?
No.
6:26.
No, it's the whim of the daughter. She's a wench.
Well, now, I guess was beheading a common thing back in that time? I mean, I know it will be in the tribulation.
Well, he didn't want to behead him because he knew that people thought of John as a prophet. It would create all kinds of craziness. But beheading wasn't the thing. It was crucifixion. That was the more painful thing. But the woman who was in the adulterous affair issue against the Jewish, because also she was a cousin, so she was like, they were like, look, you can't be like, in your marriage. So she was just sick of hearing his constant, judgment. So she put up her daughter to ask for his head. So she hated John because the truth resonated with her and convicted her. She wanted his loud mouth to be shut. You don't want people to keep telling the truth when it exposes your sin. So she wanted his mouth to be shut. Put the daughter up to dancing for him, and then she says, okay, fine. As far as the reason why the beheading, I think it's because Herod was scared stiff to crucifixion. There's no way in Hades he's taken a man that they revere as a prophet, possibly the reincarnation of Elijah. There's no way he's doing a crucifixion with that guy. There's no way. And so even the Jews themselves didn't know what to do with him, what to call him. So he's like, I was going to behead him. I think it was a quick, easy fix, because that wasn't normal to behead people. And matter of fact, he did it not in public, in private. It said they beheaded him in prison, and they brought the head to him on a platter. So it happened in secrecy behind the walls of the Roman. It wasn't like it was out in public. Everybody saw it. It wasn't like that. So he did it privately, and he did it quickly to make it so that it would be just not a public spectacle. He couldn't afford the bad press, if you will, from the Jewish people that were on his side. It was bad enough he had to die because of what he promised he would do at his word. He didn't want to make it compounded, make it worse, and make it public. But it still got bad for him doing that. Yes, sorry.
Todd said it was her mother that put the idea in her head.
Yeah, she's a witch.
Mark 6:24.
Yep.
Vicky said that verse speaks of the oaths and the guests, and he couldn't refuse her.
Yep.
Okay, I see by reading earlier verse.
Yep. She was just she was convicted of the fact he kept calling her a sinner from adultery and so forth, and she got sick of hearing it. So finally, when he was in prison, she got her chance to stay. He's been there for a while, and her husband was not brave enough. He didn't have the guts and the courage to take his life, because he knew she's just filled with emotional reasons. He's logically thinking it through, going, "There's no way that's going to be awful for me." Until she tricks her daughter to go dance, tricks him, and the rest is history. So that's why the beheading was, because she hated him. That was the impetus of it. But why the actual act of that method? Because it was a private transaction. It was behind the walls of the prison, the jail. It wasn't publicly seen, so that they could just later on, talk about that in a passing note without nobody actually living it more insightfully, or I should say more emotionally. That would raise more of a tumult in the city. He couldn't afford that. So anyway, so the whole summation of this is to get you to see that. So Jesus was actually, again, he was 35 to 36 years old when he died and rose again. Jesus' ministry was actually 4 years. But that goes back to, if you go to Matthew 13, remember he turned away in Matthew 13, Matthew 12 and 13, excuse me. Matthew 12 and 13 happened before Matthew 14, where Herod's thinking back to when he killed John, which means that when Jesus is talking about Matthew 12 and 13, when he tells the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin people, when he said to them in chapter 12, and he talks about, let me see here, in verse 31, therefore I say to you that every other sin and blasphemy will be forgiven you, but not the blasphemy of the Spirit will not be forgiven. Because, of course, they were calling him Beelzebub back in verse 27. And then in verse 13, or chapter 13, excuse me, chapter 13 of Matthew, on the next day, Jesus, having gone out of the house of Israel, that is, in type, sat by the side of the lake. So that means that Israel, that means his ministry was for 4 years. So it was 1 year to Israel, or I should say, it was 1 year less than 2 to Israel. And it was 2 years plus. 2 years plus. He included Gentiles. Because we used to say he turned to the Gentiles like the last year and a half. No. Because remember, he was teaching, when John was killed, he was already teaching for just over a year to Israel. So it was just under 2 years. It was just under 2 years, and he cut them off short. Then he goes to the Gentiles for 2 years plus. So he was with them for like a year and a half, and with us for 2.5 years. So his ministry was 4 years long. So I'm going to be generous and say a year and a half to them. But it was and it was 2 years and a half for us. So again, it just tweaks a little bit of things. When you hear songs, it says, when he was 33, and no, he was 35 or 36, depending on if you count the day of his birth or day of his conception. Day of his conception is a technical age to count, which means he was 36 when he died, which is the technical accurate age, which means that he was 30 plus 6, which is 30, the age of maturity and completion, and 6, the heir, the inheritance. Well, no joke, right? He is the one. Yes?
Vicki said my question goes back to Esther 5:3-6, and the same question given to Esther at a banquet.
Esther 5:36? There's
Yes.
no there's no verse 36.
5:3-6. 3 and 6.
Oh, 5 verses 3 and 6. Then the king said unto her, what wilt thou, queen? Was a request. And oh yeah. Yeah, he used that same, that was a nomenclature Herod used from back in Xerxes' day about that was showing how much he loved her. That's how much that Salome's daughter impressed Herod. He was, yes.
And she said, I guess kings cannot refuse.
Yeah, once they say that statement, yeah. Well, first of all,
If it's at a banquet.
Yep. Which, by the way, again, is interesting because in the days of Purim, it was announced over a banquet about who the wrongdoer was. Jesus was brought through inspection and then followed by a banquet to announce that he had his first miracle to announce who he was. What a coincidence. Again, there's too many coincidences, time frame wise, the events wise, the travel time, everything makes sense. But I hope that this helps to really bring some excitement, because with this being said, that means that if you count the 2 years prior to, we're actually in 1991 when you consider, again, what's happened. Which means that you have 7 years tribulation left. That means you only have 2 years left. Which means a year before the finality, there has to be a dome and temple happening, which means next year, 2019, is a very pivotal year to, more than ever before, be very attentive to Dome of the Rock, what's going to happen over there, and evidence that's going to begin the beginning of all things. That first shoe to fall, that dome goes down, that temple gets then reconstructed. If it's going to be in 2 years, then that first shoe to fall has to happen next year. I'm not saying that definitively. I'm not putting forth dates. I'm just putting forth an excitement and over relevance things to keep yourself attentive and alert and aware. Who knows?
Psalm 19, if anything each letter, and has 8, and of course, here's like the 8 millennia, and then there isn't a 9th, I think, because that's the age of the ages, the throne of God and the Lamb, but each of those Hebrew letters, those 22 Hebrew letters, gets 8 verses apiece.
That's pretty cool. And by the way, if he, go back to Numbers also, if he starts his ministry from his conception, he'd be 32. That means he's 30, the days of maturity, and 2, the number for witness and testimony, and division from. So he's separate from John the Baptist, who they were confusing the two together, conflating John the Baptist as the Messiah. And he was also separated in the temptation to be divided against that. But it was also a testimony of who he was. So you could see the relevance to 30 and 2, which is how old he was technically from conception when he was baptized. And it goes back to it. So these numbers all mean something. And so it's interesting how people put a big emphasis on being 30, but what's the big deal if he's 32 when he started? How's that a big deal? I don't understand what the problem is with that. There's no problem with that. People have a big problem with that. When they go, oh my gosh, he started at 32, that's sacrilege. Why? That's just the way it is. That's the way it is. So no big deal.
Another thing, come before his presence with singing. In a way, Psalm 19 is the apex of all the Psalms. I mean,
Psalm
if it
119.
was a song, this is the big song of Psalms.
Yeah.
Psalm 119 for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's such
That's
a
pretty
big
awesome.
deal. And
Yeah.
the longest chapter in the Bible, bar none.
Longer, yeah. And I don't put much, see, the thing is with the chapters, I know what you're saying. I don't put a lot of emphasis on chapters as much because man put them there, whereas the whole book was a scroll usually. So, but anyway, but I will tell you, we'll end with this, and I had to put a chart together with this, obviously. This is a lot of stuff. But hopefully it's been helpful, and I've been excited by it, but I come across too excited to you guys. But let's close in a moment of prayer, and we'll just reconvene. So, Father, thank you for this time we've had together with you. Thank you for your love, your insight, and just your word you give to us to help us, encourage us, and to keep us restored and excited and watchful to your coming. Keep us just like John the Baptist, just to engage our process, just to be faithful and diligent regardless of what happens or what doesn't happen, that we're just happy to be in your will and doing what you want us to do. Help us to be like him, and we may have shortcomings where we want to see evidence of why it's worth it all, or some benefits of the fruits of our labor, but in the end, let us be just of strong faith like him, just to, more often than not, just trust that we're where you want us to be, doing what you want us to do, and don't focus on what happens out of it. Just be doing and being and thinking what you want us to be doing and thinking. And thank you for all you are in our lives. And for this new year coming up, we pray this be a year filled with excitement and who knows what happens. And we just thank you in all these things we ask in Jesus, Yeshua's name. Amen.